Hello, and welcome to the Hammer Museum online. I'm Connie Butler, and I'm Chief Curator here at the Hammer. Tonight, this morning in Los Angeles, I'm delighted to welcome you to a conversation with artist Leonor Antunes and independent curator Jenelle Porter on the occasion of the exhibition Witch Hunt, which is currently on view at the Hammer until January 9th. Leonor Antunes is a Portuguese artist living in Berlin whose practice provides a unique contemplation on modern art, architecture, and design through a reinterpretation of sculpture, materiality, and form in a given space in which she works. Inspired by important makers in the 20th century, most often, although not exclusively, taking the work of female protagonists as her subject and inspiration, her work begins with deep research that can include the archive and the direct physical encounter with the artist's work. She transposes characteristic shapes, patterns, and dimensions rooted in her research of historical subjects, building a sculptural vocabulary that is directly informed and inspired by artisanal techniques and methodologies. Leonor has represented Portugal in the Venice Biennale in 2019, and her work has appeared in major international exhibitions around the world where she has made her site-related interventions. Today, she will speak about her installation in Witch Hunt titled The Homemaker and Her Domain, which is also on view in another iteration in the chapel at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. For the installation in Paris, her work is based on the life and work of Michiko Yamawaki, a Japanese artist who attended the Bauhaus, and the designer Charlotte Perriand, who spent time in Japan in the 40s and 50s, highlighting what Antunes has called an intergenerational modernity. Janelle Porter is an independent curator based in Los Angeles, whose exhibitions have focused on craft histories, among other interests. In particular, her ambitious shows include Dirt on Delight, Impulses That Form Clay at the ICA Philadelphia in 2009, and Fiber Sculpture 1960 to the Present in 2014 at the ICA Boston, where she was senior curator. We invited Janelle to meet Leonor today because she's a scholar of several artists who've been a great influence on Leonor Antunes' work. Most recently, Porter curated the exhibition Kay Sekimachi, Geometries at the Berkeley Art Museum earlier this year. The exhibition just closed recently. And she'll be talking about Sekimachi's work tonight, as well as the mid-century textile artist and designer Trude Guermonprez, as well as other artists who come into her curatorial projects. But both of these artists are subjects of Leonor's installation in Witch Hunt. Leonor and Janelle are each going to give a short presentation, and then we will have a roundtable discussion. So I want to welcome them, Leonor and Janelle, back to the screen to join me. Hello, both of you, Los Angeles and Berlin. It's nice to see you both.
Hi. You too.
We all are with our books.
We all own books. Thank you, Connie. Thank you so much.
I think it's appropriate, actually, given the nature of all of our research, which we can talk a little bit more about today. So I think, Leonor, we'll just turn it over to you to begin.
Thank you, Connie.
Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And I must say, I'm really happy to take part on this really great project that you and Anne have been planning for almost 2 years. I think, no, we had this conversation about 2 years ago. And so my project really changed among this. We had, initially, I really wanted to go to Los Angeles, do some research, but it turned out like with the pandemics, this was no longer possible. So I ended up actually changing my method process. And this is, I think it would be interesting if we could discuss a little bit the project I'm doing. I'm presenting it at the Hammer. And maybe we could show a slide, please. So this project has, Connie has mentioned, it's called now I forgot my own title. So I've been, I guess I've been trying to research on, in particular, the artists, women artists more in particular, that have been part of the modern movement, so to say, but it has, in some ways, the work had been quite marginalized, not just to the fact that they were women working in their fields, but also because most of them also had to immigrate to other countries and, like due to several situations, their work was not, according to my point of view, enough recognized. But they were quite influential, giving access to other artists' works in the future, but also the whole idea of modernity that they constructed throughout their work. So this project is based on, so I decided to, for this show, I wanted to develop a new work. And I wanted to create a kind of ambience like that could dominate the space, but not take it completely full. So there's a lot of transparency, but still wanting to play with gravity. So there's a lot of sculptures which are hanging from these structures, and the structures for whom I don't know, some people haven't yet seen the exhibition. There are several bamboo poles which have this wood kind of shelving system, which is placed on top of it. And through that system, there's a lot of sculptures hanging from this kind of myriad of shelves. And the sculpture is based on actually a chair that was designed by Charlotte Perriand when she was working in Japan. And she was invited in the 40s, in the beginning of, actually 1940s. Exactly, I think one day after the German army occupied France, she left the country and she went to Japan. And she actually received an official invitation from the Japanese embassy in Paris, asking her to serve as a consultant in industrial design to the Department of Trade Promotion under the auspices of the Imperial Ministry of Commerce and Industry. And the ministry hoped that a new foreign advisor could suggest ways of boosting Japan's exports of furniture and household items from the West. So she basically arrives there and she starts to be involved a lot with the craftsmen. She doesn't want to, she's still seen as like the French for Japanese society around that time. This is like the 40s, so we have to understand like Japan is a quite strict society in terms of how they look at women working still today. And so she arrives there and she goes to the different workshops. She wants to work with craftsmen, and I was interested in approaching a work that she did in Japan, because in this project there's also another artist which I was interested. I mean, there's several other things, but which is Michiko Yamawaki, which is an Japanese artist that studied at the Bauhaus, and she only studied there for 2 years, but she was Japanese, and she was the first Japanese artist to study at the Bauhaus. And I was interested in combining the two figures because of the way the way they have worked in their out of their context, but still aiming to provide some of their, relations that they have with premises and cultural premises that they have working outside their countries. And for this project in the Hammer, I was very interested. So the idea was to give like a base, like, a structure, which is, as I said, derived from this chair of Perriand that I kind of extrapolated the dimensions, and I separated parts of the legs and placed them as like a structure that everything hangs from. I wanted to use bamboo because this is one of the things she was very criticized in Japan while she worked there. Was she only lived there for 1 year, from 40 to 41, But in 41, she does this exhibition in a kind of store that she organizes with another architect. And it was a kind of a way of her to present the work she developed in Japan, but also showing a lot of utensils, like Japanese utensils that she was very interested in. The Migei movement, for example, which is the folk arts movement in Japan. So the idea of working with local craftsmen, people that are really, like very old traditional ways of working with materials that she was interested in, kind of, and this was also the Mingei movement was interested in giving these people not only collecting what they did, but also giving them new designs that they could produce with very remote means. So she, in this exhibition, she uses these objects, but at the same time, she uses her own furniture that she developed there in Japan while she was living there. And at that time, she's very criticized by the kind of extra use of bamboo. So they think this is a kind of Western idea of fetishization of bamboo, because they think that, well, bamboo is a quite difficult material to use and to work from, and there's actually necessary very how do I say, very handful skills to work with bamboo, and she didn't have them, but also she searched for people who could work with it, but they think that she over extrapolated this use, which for them wouldn't make sense. So she's criticized in that way, and this is one of the things I was interested. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here we see other groups of sculptures which are made of, some are made of straw silk, which is the silk that is extracted from the cocoons, but it's not treated. And this silk, I bought it in Brazil because I know this small, very small company that produces, that actually they don't produce, but they dye these silks with natural colors. So one is from a plant, and the other one is a vegetable colored. And these two sculptures are, for me, related with the work of Trude Guermonprez, which is another artist I was interested that immigrated from Germany first to the Black Mountain, where she teaches. She arrived there, I think, in the end of the 40s, I think 47, if I'm not mistaken. She was quite young. Her parents had already moved there because they were Jewish, and her parents were teaching also at the Black Mountain. They arrived first, and she joins them later. She kind of she was Jewish, she was hiding in the Netherlands, and she arrives at the Bauhaus exactly at the moment when Anni Albers and Josef Albers are doing a sabbatical leave, and she's going there to replace actually her classes. And later when she comes back, Anni Albers asks Trude to join her in the classes. So she continues there until the Black Mountain College closes. And I've been interested in her work since a long time, but I never had, like, for me, this project was also the moment where I thought it could be possible for me to engage more with the work. So I've met, for example, this Jacqueline Sullivan, who's like a young curator who wrote her thesis about her work, which is, it's very difficult to find documentation on her work. This is one of the reasons I really wanted to come to New York, to go to the Copper Hewitt, where it's the place where they own a few of her weavings. And she developed this technique of she didn't develop it, but she really explored it. After the Black Mountain, she went to teach in other colleges One was a ceramic studio of a friend of her that had this workshop in California, and then she later went to Auckland to teach at the College of Art there. And there she really taught this technique of the double weaving and the triple weaving. And this is what I've tried to do here in these sculptures. They are not really based on her weavings. I mean, more the idea of like this pattern of the shapes of these figures, geometric figures, which is the triangles. And how this kind of figure gets crossed by the same figure in space. And so I worked with this with a person I've been working since a long time. Her name is Guida. She's a wonderful weaver in Portugal that I've been working with her since a long time. I don't weave myself because there's a lot of my work which is very focused on specific skills. I don't do many of them. I actually like to work with people that I know, small workshops, and in this case, it's also a way of engaging them in my process, and I feel engaged in their process, and I learn a lot from them, and I think it's mutual. And so in this case, I really want to learn how to weave, but it's something that will require some of my time, which I don't have now, but in the future, I hope I can do it. So can we see the next slide, please? I have some other sculptures that I decided to introduce in this kind of cluster myriad of objects that are suspended. One of them is another piece made of leather that actually is a kind of a drawing. For me, it's a drawing. It's a drawing in space. It's a sculpture made of very thin leather stripes, which, if we lay them flat on the floor, they kind of reconstitute some partitions that I've measured in a house made by this designer, Greta Grossman. Another interesting female architect, actually designer. She was a designer that also immigrated to California due to the occupation of the Nazis in Germany, and also this, Holocaust happening. And she goes first to San Francisco, and then in California. She's not a trained architect, but she's a designer. But due to the context that she had managed to build several houses in California, I think 17. And when I was doing a residency there in 2008, I visited one of these houses that was for sale, which I think today is destroyed. But I managed to measure a few elements in the house, and this is one of them. So this is a kind of, it's an old piece that I've made, but I thought I've only showed it once, and I thought it wouldn't really make sense here to kind of join this person together with the other figures that are populating the structure. Can we see the next slide, please? And then there's these other pieces which are made of pineapple. It's a natural fiber. It comes from the pineapple. I wanted to discover new ways of working with not using leather, but using more natural materials. Actually, the whole idea of this project is also that everything kind of nurtures itself, and the materials will degrade, and like this, the wood tarnishes, and we see the time of the passing of time really embedded in this project. And this looked like kind of the gray piece, which is the green one, which is suspended. It looks like some kind of pillows which are standing upright on the structure. They're actually based on the pillows that this chair had. So when Charlotte Perriand designed this chair, it's a chair for two persons to sit one side by the other. And they have these huge cushions. And I've tried to create something with the cushions by trying to reformulate this shape making this kind of rotation of like the 19 degrees rotation of these cushions. There's another piece. Can we see the next slide, please? No, the previous one. I don't think the previous one. Yes. I don't think we see it here. There's another work which is on, so there are two main structures. There's another structure on the back, which has another woven piece, but it's made of copper wire, which I've also done it a long time before because I was interested also in the work of Kay Sekimachi, which is another artist that was trained by, although she was American, she was a student of Trude Guermonprez, and she developed this, really worked with this technique of the double weaving, where she used mainly fishing wire. So this kind of monofilament, beautiful sculptures she did, and I've used copper wire. I was interested in creating this kind of mesh, and also just using a kind of cylinder, which it's rotating in itself, and it's also suspended in one of the other sculptures. Can we see the next slide, please? The next one. Yes, thank you. And I wanted to show this project because it's a project I've done this year. I just finished the exhibition now. It opened at the same time as the Hammer exhibition. And it has the same title, The Homemaker and Their Domain. And because, this year and last year, I had to change a little bit the method I'm using normally in my work, which is visiting archives, visiting houses that I pre-select, measuring elements, really working with measures, and really trying to extract, this idea of measurement from a site. Because I couldn't do this anymore, I tried to focus my year on these two projects, since also my other shows were being postponed. But I thought it would be interesting for me to just try to make the same exhibition. I mean, working with the same materials, but really trying to make completely different projects. So last year I was living in Lisbon. I decided to go there for a year, and I wanted to work in a ceramic workshop. I mean, I've been wanting to work in ceramics since a long time, but couldn't really find the proper workshop to do it. So I've met these two women in Lisbon who run this really beautiful ceramic workshop. And I proposed them to work in their studio we worked there for 7 months consequently. And I told them normally it happened with other of my projects, for example, the weavings, every time there's like weaving sculptures, that I worked with Gita, but in this case, I thought I cannot delegate this work to anyone, so I have to be able to put my hands in the clay and really understand what I'm doing. And because I had absolutely no experience of working with it before, and they accepted it, so I worked with them for several months in the studio, and I wanted to make this kind of floor piece. Well, first I must say, sorry, that this is an exhibition that took place in a chapel of Beaux-Arts, which is a beautiful chapel, which it's from the 17th century. It's basically, today it belongs to the University of Fine Arts. But previously, in the 17th century was a museum, and it was ordered by the queen, who actually thought that a lot of the monuments after the French Revolution were destroyed. So she wanted a way to preserve these monuments was by making copies of it. So in this chapel, there's a lot of, everything is a copy, like the Michelangelo painting, which we see on the back, like the Coglione sculpture it's also a copy. Everything in this space are copies. And I think it's very rare that an artist is asked to choose the site where the exhibition takes place. Normally we are invited to have exhibitions in museums or institutions or galleries, unless it's a public space. But because this is a festival, I could choose any of the sites that belong to the city. And I really wanted to have my work inside a place which is so full of copies, even though, it's very male dominated. But I thought, since I work so much from works that actually belong to other people, I thought it would be an interesting idea for me to be in a place where everything is basically fake. So I did this floor piece. Can we see the next slide, please? Which is, it's made of ceramic tiles that we've produced them by hand. So everything is handmade, cut with metal plaques with these precise shapes. And the pattern comes from a fabric, actually not a fabric, a carpet that Michiko Yamawaki, this Japanese weaver that studied at the Bauhaus for 2 years before the school finished, closed in Dessau. So she goes to the Bauhaus, and she and her husband are kind of the promoters of the Bauhaus in Japan, because they collected a lot of furnitures. She brought her looms from the school to Japan. They did an exhibition where they showed a lot of the furniture from the Bauhaus. So they kind of introduce this whole idea of design. And she teaches, she starts teaching weaving in Japan after she comes back from Germany. And she did this series of drawings, which I found in some of her publications that I had. And she did a series of drawings based on carpets that she produced very few work. And I was interested in working with some of her drawings. So I based and she was very criticized. This was an important factor for me, was that she was very much criticized while she was studying by the use of the colors that she used in her drawings, which really didn't follow the Bauhaus kind of regime. Because even if we think Bauhaus is a very progressive school, which it was still very strict the way the students had to deal with their patterns of colors, the exercises. They had a lot of exercises, they had to follow the exercises. And she never wanted to kind of follow this idea of this pattern, of this logic of colors, because she was coming from Japan, with quite traditional family. So she used kind of these stones, which are, earth stones, which the school didn't really accept it, so to say. Can we see the next slide, please? This is a kind of more wider view from the exhibition. So like the floor piece was really about this idea of making a kind of since everything around in the space, like all the sculptures are placed either on planes or they are like, architectural elements. I thought for me it was important to make a piece which kind of functions as a plinth. So the idea of making a floor piece, which is based on one of these drawings of Michiko Yamawaki's of a carpet she never realized. And the colors, I tried to be very close to the colors of the original drawing. Can we see the next slide? Next one. The next one. Next one. I wanted to show an image. I think this is good. Maybe next one. Yeah, thank you. So here we see the floor, and there's some elements which kind of go up, and so I kind of create this dynamism on the floor. And there's another sculpture which I've done, which is based on another drawing by another carpet that she made, and I wanted to create this edition. Can we see this, the next slide? So here we see the several elements of the floor. Next slide, please. And this is the edition I wanted to make based on one of her drawings, which is a circular drawing divided in 6 parts. And I wanted to create this kind of vases, which, and also repeating kind of the same tones that exist in the drawing. Next slide. And on the floor, as well as in the space, there are other sculptures which I thought could be interesting to link, again, the work of Michiko Ayamawakis with the work that Charlotte Perriand developed in Japan. So for me, this is more or less where it started. And then from this project, I went up to the idea of the structure that I've shown at the Hammer Museum. But the idea of combining these 2 figures and the idea of being 2 women artists working abroad, you know, going to these countries for different reasons, but really trying to create work within that context, but being completely out of context in the sense that I think they were at some point important, but also very misunderstood. And this was kind of my link for this project, to have this kind of 2 figures inhabiting the spaces in different times. So there's a lot of sculptures, other sculptures, which are based either on tables that Charlotte Perriand designed. Next slide. This is a detail of the sculpture, which is a kind of elongated table, like they extrapolated the dimensions of this table. It's a kind of a table for the bed that she designed in plywood. Next slide. And then there's other elements which kind of proliferate in space, and they are based on tables that she designed, not necessarily built. So more or less the idea of this, the form of the sculpture takes the shape of one of these drawings of tables that she designed. And they also made of ceramic, and then they have this, I wanted the plates to be lift up from the floor, but not really, really high. So they're quite low. And they are made of wood, and they have this kind of lacquered covering, layering. And then there are some screens, which are actually previous works, which I've done for another exhibition that I thought could be important here to break this kind of symmetry that exists in the room. Next slide. And the ceramic have these prints from weaving mats. Actually, these carpets that I bought in Mexico called petates, and they have this. They are made of palm, and they put them in markets in the street for, they're very, very cheaply made, like in the sense that they are very fastly made. They are not really, they're beautiful woven, but they are really used to be degraded easily. So they put them in markets, and people, so like the floor gets covered, and people can just not create so much dust around, because there's always food involved. And I had this idea before to make this kind of prints from clay, because once in Sharjah, I visited, when I was doing the Sharjah Biennial, we visit this archaeological site, and I've seen there some bricks which had the prints of like mats, woven mats, like, so we could understood that, in previous times people would still making these mats and putting it on the floor, and they would eat on the floor with these mats. So these prints on the bricks really kind of striking me, and I really wanted to use this this idea of like the floor mat that is used on the floor that gets printed on the ceramic. Next slide. This is another view. There's a sculpture hanging, which is not really part of this series, but I thought I wanted to just use one element in this space that gets suspended. And it's a sculpture I've done 2 years ago called Mira, like Mira Schendel, another artist. I really like the work. She was Swiss and emigrated to Brazil. She did these beautiful sculptures called droguinhas in Portuguese, mean little nothings, and they're made of rice paper. And well, she keeps twisting the paper and knotting the paper, and she creates these very fragile, beautiful, kind of ephemeral sculptures, very small. So I was thinking, when I was doing this work, I was thinking about the idea of like using not the idea of twisting paper, but more or less having the idea of a line, a unity of measure. And how do we, from this line, how can we create volume, but just by torsing it and knotting it and twisting it. So I built it on site. That's why, so the piece is very long, but I built it in a space which had exactly the same dimensions as this room. So that's why the sculpture looks perfect here, but actually it's because it was the space where it existed had exactly the same dimensions. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So just to finish this, so the show, I wanted to have this exhibition in 2 parts of the city that open in different times. So like more or less 1 month in between. And so I asked the festival if I could do an exhibition in a kind of, more kind of classical space, so to say, this kind of 17th century site with all the fake sculptures. And then I wanted to do an exhibition in a kind of more domestic environment. And I would ideally like a modernist venue. But it was quite difficult to find. So I asked this collector, who's Nathalie Serroussi, who has this beautiful house designed by André Bloch, who was an architect from Paris that was very close to Charlotte Perrien. And he had this magazine, a French magazine, which was called Architecture d'aujourd'hui, and he was really trying to promote her work through the magazine. And he designed this habitacle. He called it habitacle, it's from the 60s, so it's not modern. It's like 60 something. I can't remember the year exactly. And he created this as a kind of a sculpture in itself, because he also made small sculptures that really look like this. And for him was a space where he could invite other artists to show their works. And so she preserved it, and sometimes she does small exhibitions, not often. So I proposed her to have the second part of the show there. So actually this one actually opened first. And here I installed very few pieces, like just this group of sculptures that are called indirect lighting, that are based on lamps that Berrian did also not in Japan, but after she comes back from Japan, she designs the Japanese embassy, or the house of the Japanese ambassador in Paris, and she designs this kind of strange lamps. And I wanted to create some sculptures based on the lamps, but because they sit on poles, but they run horizontally in space. So I had this idea of rotation, transforming these lamps in this kind of blocks. Next slide. It's also ceramic. They are placed on these metal plates, stainless steel plates. And I've made them in groups. So they kind of function not individually, but as a group of 3 And the colors are based on the colors of the clay we were using. So we did a small, very light glazing, but the actual clay is this color. Next slide. Next slide. And then there's this piece on the floor, which is based on another, actually the only carpet that, next slide, the only carpet that Michiku produced in Germany. So I based this, it's also made of ceramic, and I based this piece on the drawing of because I haven't seen the carpet in real. So I based this sculpture on the measures of the shapes of the figures in the drawing, and I kind of extrapolated the measures and play a little bit with it, but really trying to focus as much as possible on the original colors. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonor.
I think it was long.
No, it's okay. It's so nice to be really deeply immersed in those beautiful installations. So, Janelle.
Hi.
I'd love to hear from you. Hello.
Thank you. So we can begin the slides, and I'll speak over their presence. I recently organized a survey exhibition, sort of a condensed survey of the work of Kay Sekimachi, who is a born and bred Bay Area artist who's resided in Berkeley since she was a small child, except for the year she was interned by the American government during World War II. And this exhibition was at the UC Berkeley Art Museum from June to October of this year. I'll start with a couple of these installation shots just to sort of set you in the place, since we so recently put this work on view. Next slide. So this is the situation of the work. And Kay Sekimachi's work is really integral to the story of art and fiber in the US, and especially the 1960s and 1970s, when we see a blossoming of what is called the international fiber art movement, which I'll come back to. And along with other primarily mid-20th century artists, but really sort of like edging into 60s and 70s, she transformed alongside with them this material of fiber from a material that was really confined to industry and craft to one that was used for art, and that essentially expanded the categories of modern and contemporary art as we talk about it now, as we are discussing it here today. So Kay has, since her career really began, made experimental works with linear pliable elements, threads, strings, etc., that truly unite art and craft, economy and intricacy, and Japanese and American artistic traditions. So next slide. What does Kay make? Kay becomes well known for creating these, as Leonor mentioned, double weaves, triple weaves, essentially multi-harness, multi-layered weavings. I find it sometimes almost as difficult to describe. I am not a weaver, full disclosure. I am an art curator. I don't make things. And no matter how many times it's been explained to me or even demonstrated, there's a complexity that is, I think challenging to get one's mind around unless one has the hands-on material. But if you can imagine a kind of mode of working flat on a loom, and then when this work comes off the loom, it becomes multidimensional. These are some of the works Kay makes beginning in the 1960s, early 1960s and mid 1960s. Next slide. This is a wonderful just photography series of this work as twisted in space. You can really, it's rare that we get to see sculpture from a lot of different angles, and this shows like the front on and how the dimension takes place. Again, this is monofilament, it's fishing line. Next slide. Kay gets her hands on some monofilament in the 1960s when it is not a very old material at that point. I mean, we're sort of familiar with monofilament fishing line. We use it for a lot of things, but it was a friend of hers mother who worked at DuPont got a spool of it, and it came into Kay's hands and she starts to use it. Now, using synthetic materials at this point is very unusual for hand weavers. Synthetic materials begin to enter industry at this point, especially with some of the incredible female designers who are designing and adapting hand weaving to industry, but it's still quite unusual. And, if you have ever held monofilament, which most of us have at some point, it's really slippery. It's hard to knot. And when one thinks about that, you can think about how hard it would be to weave with. Next slide, please. Still, Kay weaves these incredible sculptures with monofilament. Her white sculptures are the color of the monofilament, so that like milky kind of clearish white. The black ones come from her dyeing the monofilament with red dye, like in her sink, and it's actually it turned out to be incredibly color fast. But these are, showing us the simple moves that artists make, or rather practical moves that enhance the materials. This shows the work Nagar, and a details. You can kind of see some of what's happening with the multi-layers, the many layers, excuse me. Next slide. So how does Kay get here? She begins weaving through classes in the late 1940s and early 1950s when she returns to Berkeley after the imprisonment during World War II. And she is working in the mode that many artists are, which has become very influenced by emigre weavers who relocate to Chicago, to Black Mountain College, for example, as Leonor mentioned, to the Bay Area. And you see this sort of natural colors, natural fibers, and some of these, grid formations. So this piece is called Square Study in Brown from 1957. Kay, she's taking like night classes, summer classes. She spends her last $150 on a loom when she happens upon weavers at school, and she quit school because she can no longer afford to stay in school. And as I said, sort of teaches herself and takes classes. Next slide. This work by Anni Albers from 1949 shows some of the modes that the artists at the time were working in. Of course, Anni Albers her work has become so influential now, but we have to recall that the channels of communication and dispersion were much, much fewer in the 1940s and 1950s, and Albers's books don't become well known, especially to us, contemporary art people, until much later, and increasingly so now. But for example, Anni Albers was the first female artist to have a solo show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and shows works like these, which sort of take space, move away from the wall. But Albers, she doesn't actually stay in this mode. This is this very experimental work that moves back out, but it's important to note that these works relate to the kind of, as it's called, room divider, these kind of architectural spaces, these room dividers, these wall hangings, which were not only decor, but in some sense functional. Next slide. This is a work called Room Divider, two different works. One, they look sort of the same because I'm showing a detail of one, but they're two different works, and that Kay Sekimachi makes in 1960. So here we went from that piece, the study, to, which was, a heavier wool, to this natural linen and jute, very transparent, very light, and that hang in space. Next slide. Kay then, she begins to study with Trude Guermonprez in 1954 during summer sessions at California College of Arts and Crafts in Oakland, which is still around, called CCA. And her work is really influenced by the new techniques and progressive concepts that Trude is teaching and has, in some sense, imported from her own European training. And I'll come back to Trude's work at the end and flesh that out a bit more. So she begins her work really moves from these utilitarian objects to small abstract tapestries, the wall hangings, and finally to these dimensional free hanging sculptures. Next slide. I think just to spend a moment on this milieu of the international fiber art movement, Kay's work is in relation to work like Leonor Antunes, who's working in Lower Manhattan in the 1960s, making, this is a black and white slide, but what you're looking at are natural colored and black dyed wool linen hangings, that natural coarse material that allows a kind of thickness and dimension, but still they're quite flat. They're given dimension by the insertion of rods and interlacings. Work like Ed Rosbach, who's a vastly underknown artist who worked in Berkeley for years, headed up the art department at Berkeley, and was really this kind of like proto-postmodern weaver who experimented with every kind of material and did every kind of form. Next slide. But I want to counter for you that works at this time when Kay was making her monofilaments were big. They took space, they took up the floor. These artists were really trying to really force attention where we looked at the work as sculpture and no longer as craft and no longer as utilitarian objects. This is the image of a Lausanne tapestry biennial, which is, for those of you interested in fiber and don't know the history of Lausanne tapestry biennials, I encourage you to look into them because they are really like one of the genesis points of so much that happened in the development of the international fiber art movement. The next slide. And wanted to show you, especially the work on the left of your screen is an image of Deliberate Entanglements, a very important show that took place at UCLA in 1971. You see what, like big, they called them hairy, like rough. These were woven off loom with hands, etc. And for a very prime example is Magdalena Abakanovich's wonderful, huge hand woven coarse material abacans, which were not named by her, but after her. So I think, we can all aspire to an artist making work that's actually named after them. Next slide. So, we see all that, and that was very much on theme. And then you have Kay Sekimachi working with monofilament, making these very fine, very technical, very detailed objects that are diaphanous that, I wanted to put that counter up to you. After Kay makes those monofilament wonderful hangings that she's so well known for, she moves into some other kinds of works with monofilament. For example, these works, which are, she calls kurogawa. She uses a lot of Japanese words for her work. Sometimes, as we see here, kurogawa is Black River. Sometimes she uses translation, sometimes not. What she's using here, though, is something called card weaving, which is an ancient Egyptian method that replaces the loom with punched cards. Next slide. She works in monofilament. She mixes linen with monofilament and makes wholly linen works, as we see here in this recent exhibition of the installation at Berkeley. Next slide, please. Here's Kay using the card weaving method. It's an incredible kind of method to watch. She's working on a rather long board that her husband custom made for her so she could make these very long hanging weavings. She titles them for rivers because she was really pulling out what she saw as sort of eddies and flows in this work. And she works always like iteratively. What's so critical about the way that Kay Sekimachi has worked all of her career is that she marries one technique with one material. When, it's card weaving with linen, it's the monofilaments with the multi-layered weaving on the loom. Colors are minimal, the techniques are specific. This is really quite different than what so many of her contemporaries are doing, but is not necessarily apart from the way other artists and artisans are working in the Bay Area and other places. So just to say, while some of her we might see some of her approaches as being unique. I never want to let us forget these artists are part of a milieu. Next slide. Some Maragawa's same approach of this card weaving technique, adding 2 colors and some play with dimensions. Next slide. So just to kind of walk you through some other works quickly that Kay has made, because Kay is still living, still working. She's 92 years old. And or she's 94 years old. Sorry. She, beginning in the 70s, there starts to be like a little pushback in the international fiber community around all the big works. And the first international exhibition of miniature textiles takes place in London in 1974. And from that invitation, Kay begins to work more small. This is a basket with brown lines, 4 3/4 inches. Next slide. I want to point out, this is an installation view, that this is not a box woven flat and pieced together. This is woven like the multi-layered works on the loom. It is woven on a loom. It is then folded into its dimension. Next slide, which we can sort of see here. That's not a seam, that's woven. So Kay really goes after like the complexity. She loves to make something that is hard to make. Next slide. She makes these woven books. These are quite small, again, that accordion out. We see these different views of it, which are based on a small book that pictured ukiyo-e prints that she was the only book she took with her to the Japanese internment camp. Next slide. She works with paper. It allows her to work quickly, unlike weaving, which is an incredibly slow and intricate process. She works with modes of origami folding, as well as stitching to add sort of surface incident. She's working with papers that are, in fact, Japanese papers. She actually goes to Japan for really the first time as an adult. She went when she was a small baby. But she goes as an adult and really sort of meets some of her relatives. Her parents had immigrated to Japan, but she's born in America. And but she comes into possession of this cache of Japanese papers and begins to use them. Next slide. But you see again the simplicity, the folding, the geometry, so important to her work. The experimentation, which is, I would say, modest but very very invigorating, very vital to her work. Next slide. Moves back to the loom, but it starts to work more with warp painting. So actually applying color with indelible markers or paint to the warp. So the work on the right is called ikat box, which mimics the mode of ikat, which is a resist dyeing technique, but with painting on the warp. These are incredible works. Again, note the dimensions, 9 inches, quite intimate. Next slide. I love this slide because this is how it works, right? She's the flat weaving. You kind of see the painting on there, and with a inserted stick and a tie, it takes dimension. So again, I don't always like to dwell on the craft of this material because I think that often confines the conversations, but with Kay, she very much thinks of herself as a weaver who's interested in technique. And we see that, her work quite easily transcends technique. Next slide. After sort of working dimensionally this way, Kay returns to flat weavings, which she calls homages, which she begins about 2010. Next slide. These are about 12 by 12 inch works that are homages to some of her chosen teachers, not literal teachers, but chosen teachers. Homage to AM is Agnes Martin. Next slide, please. Show the kinds of work that Kay has looked at. And these are incredibly Very intimate. We see the use of, natural colored linen. She uses dye or indelible marker on the loom, on the warp threads and sometimes weft threads to make these marks. And next slide, please. Homage to PK, more recent work. This is her homage to Paul Klee on the left, but also this work, Pale Moon, on the right, which she made in '59 as another sort of homage to Paul Klee. Next slide, please. Finally, to come back to Trude Guermonprez, who's such an underknown figure and so important for her, especially for her teaching, frankly. Trude comes she moves to Black Mountain post-war from Europe, where she's been working and teaching and designing for industry and is quite established. Comes to Black Mountain College to join her family who had immigrated there in the 1930s. And as Leonor sketched, takes over Annie's classes during Anni Albers' sabbatical. She is not Anni Albers' student, as has been said by some. She is a professional in her own right, very, very accomplished, teaches her classes. Anni Albers comes back. They teach together until the weaving department is closed. Trude comes to California at the invitation of Margaret Wildenhain, does some sessions at Pond Farm in Guerneville, California, which is up north of San Francisco. And that's in '49 that she comes. And then she begins teaching in '52 at California College of Arts and Crafts until her premature death in 1976. But of course, like many artists, she's teaching other places. There's a wonderful picture of her teaching at Haystack Mountain School of Crafts, which is in Maine, in '56. I feel pretty certain I have that exact outfit. Fashion is timeless. Next slide. Some of Trude's 1950s weaving I wanted to include here, especially, the sort of pictorial weaving, modes of abstraction. The piece on the right is called Bluebird. The one on the right is called Calico Cat. Calico Cat was Guermonprez's homage to a Paul Klee painting that she owned. And Kay Sekimachi bought Calico Cat from Trude and still owns it. So I love thinking about this kind of this lineage, this significance of Trude as a teacher. And Trude teaches Kay so much of what she knows. Leonor mentioned some of those things. But her work, like, again, the work of the time, we can show the next slide, is restrained in palette. You see the incredible use of warp and weft materials, sort of multiple threads within the weaving itself. Texture was so important to weavers in the 1950s. It's really like the main mode that they were going for. But because we saw that previous slide, that this work is pictorial. And when you dig in there, you see how much the work sort of dissolves, the image dissolves. Next slide. Now, what Trude begins to do, though, is work dimensionally. So these are two works from the 1960s, where this is basically a double weave that, with a twist and the insertion of rods, becomes dimensional. She calls these space hangings. This is a way of putting the kind of standard wall hanging or flat woven work into space, taking sculptural space, pushing the viewer around the work, which just really hadn't been done and wasn't done often, but was starting to be done quite a bit. These are silk works. These are actually two different works, but very similar coloring. Next slide. And here we see, every registrar's nightmare, which is art hanging outside in nature. But sort of, again, another wonderful series of exhibitions to look into for those interested in craft, especially in California, and sculpture with quote unquote craft materials. The California Design series of exhibitions. This is California Design 9 from 1965. We see Guermonprez's work, third from right, alongside other works. And I wanted to show this slide. And I'm no expert on these California Design exhibition series, but that, again, she's not alone. There's a milieu. These are artists who are interested in this kind of transparency about putting objects into space taking sculptural space, essentially. Next slide. Just to show a couple of other works by Trude, some very bad from photographs. There is one book on Guermonprez's work. It is a small booklet from her posthumous retrospective at the Oakland Museum of California Art. Next slide. This is one of the reference works, I think, Leonor, that you talk about, or excuse me, that you referenced in the work at Hammer, currently on view. Incredible, smallish space hanging with metallic thread. Totally gorgeous piece from the 1960s. And finally, the last slide, please, is an installation view of an exhibition I curated in 2017 of Bay Area, essentially Bay Area fiber, where I hang Guermonprez and Sekimachi side by side, which rarely has happened, actually, with two works on the left by Guermonprez and on the right by Sekimachi. And the title of the exhibition was "A Line Can Go Anywhere," which is actually a quote that I used of Ruth Asawa's, because in fact I couldn't get a loan of Ruth Asawa's work at that time. She was becoming quite famous, finally, and deservedly. And her work sort of entered the stratosphere, as it is. I know there's an exhibition on view right now at Werner, or recently on view. And so that was my little sneaky nod to her work and its inclusion in the show by using her words for the title, because again, she's another player that should be included in this pantheon of artists who are working, like Kay with her monofilament, like Ruth Asawa with wire, to make these kind of volumetric sculptures with these linear pliable elements that we are just now beginning to recognize for their influence, for truly kind of setting the path for where we are now and the way that artists use materials and dare I say are allowed to use materials. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you both. God, it's such a pleasure to again to do a deep dive into such beautiful and little known things, really. And I want to maybe start there, which isn't how I was going to start, but it occurs to me that Leonor, you talked about, I guess the question I want to ask is about feminist methodologies for both of you. Leonor, you talked about creating an ambience with the installation in Paris. And I was thinking that often I find with your work, the approach to histories and the references, there's a kind of blurring that goes on because you're sort of mixing not only materials, but often histories, weaving them together quite literally in a way that leaves them very open, I think. And there's something, a kind of open ambiguity often about your approach, I think, to the different histories that you're looking at. And I'm curious, I want to ask you in a bit also about that methodology, like at what point is enough, at what point do you have enough information to begin, but first this question of sort of a feminist methodology. And Janelle, you obviously have foregrounded the work of women artists and makers in much of your work, and I don't think we've ever talked about it. But I guess my question is, to what degree do you both view your approach to history, this kind of networked approach to history, nonlinear approach to history, as a feminist one? Maybe, Leonor, you start.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's always a common thread, which is this idea of like, even though I think the archive now is pretty big, and the archive I've been building, I'm not the only person doing this for sure, but maybe, sometimes there's connections which haven't been built in histories that I'm interested in. And for example, for this project of the Hammer, I was really interested in bringing all this group of interesting women together that have, for some reason they have been in California, like mainly Trude didn't study at the Bauhaus. Mainly this is one of the reasons I think the work was never really paid so much attention because she actually didn't study there and she didn't come from that milieu. Mm-hmm. But, you know, being in a school in Holland where it was a similar school where she studied and, you know, kind of a small Bauhaus. So she had this kind of introduction to the Bauhaus method. But there's always, like, I would say, a common thread for me, which is this idea of women, at a certain point, designers immigrating to, you know, other countries where they do work, you know, which is not necessarily, I don't think they are also interested in being recognized, but mostly because, you know, some of them are quite intimate. But I think there's always a common thread, even if, like, I look at the history of Lina Bo Bardi in Brazil, it's a different time, like if we know now space-time generation, but again, this idea of not having, of course, the war, it's a different topic. For her was really not the war, was really, I mean, in some ways, yes, because the country was so devastated. Italy was so devastated by the war. She couldn't see any possibilities of building a work there. But also the other common thread, I would say, it's like all the interests of these people like Lina Bo Bardi, Clara Porset, you know, like I'm not talking about the artists, weavers, but more the designers, for example, or architects that were very interested in working with the vernacular and the idea of crafts, but really engaging their communities, you know, the countries where they lived. And, you know, Lina Bo Bardi really interested in the Afro, you know, communities living in Brazil and really engaging them in their process, like also collecting a lot of these objects, but really showing it and doing exhibitions, not really through the point of view of a foreigner, but rather that someone that assimilates that culture. And I think this is, you know, something I'm really interested in about, maybe thinking of my own trajectory. I think one time I heard that all artists, I think it was Laurie Anderson that said all the artists are doing kind of autobiographical work, even thinking of like someone like Gordon Martha Clark and the idea of splitting because their parents were separated, and so he starts to cut things apart. And I think this is it's such a metaphorical point of view, but I think it's very personal. All stories are very personal, and my readings and my extrapolation of things, sometimes there's a lot of complexities and confusions that get settled in the same space. But I think these connections for me are important, and they were important, and they still are important today. And I think sometimes, you know, it happened in history. Nobody made these analogies before, but I think, but it's really through, again, trying to kind of create a kind of humanity in the project, but also meeting people that have worked with them, going to workshops where these people have worked. And this is what for me is important as well.
What exactly, I'm thinking, Connie, of your question, it was sort of multi-pronged and about feminist methodology, at least in my curatorial work. Is that sort of what you're...
Yeah, I mean, I from the outside, it seems to me it's not where you started out in your curatorial work, but it's definitely where you've ended up. And I just wonder if that's kind of a conscious choice, or whether it's simply out of an interest of, you know, recuperating the histories of certain women artists, or just, I don't know what it is you think you're building, because you are building something for sure.
I think so. I mean, I love, Leonor, right at the beginning of your introduction, you were talking about intergenerational modernity, which is such an interesting term to think about, one I've never heard said. I would say it's a little bit accidental and it's a little bit on purpose, right? Like when you're beginning a career, you muddle along, but I think it owes to sort of some great mentors and teachers. I think it comes from the things I stumbled into, like, for example, that my very first internship in the art world was at AIR Gallery, the first women's cooperative gallery in Soho. And did I know those things in the time? I will admit, no, not necessarily, but they gave me a job. And then I started to spend a lot of time with women artists of a generation that at that point in the 90s, nobody was thinking about or talking about. Truly, art historical work has its trends, of course. And I think that where the work has gone, the work that I've done, it's been definitely interested in things that are quote unquote marginal, but even what's marginal becomes more central depending on the work, depending on the focus. And at one point, yes, it's artists that led me everywhere. I mean, if I look back at what I've done and, retrospectively, that's starting to be a long haul at this point, 25 years, but I worked for women curators exclusively. My first job as an assistant was with a women curator. I got to see, the whole museum was essentially with female curators. I got to work at museums that were small enough where we had a lot of contact. There were diverse staffs, diverse programming, not as diverse as maybe historically we might look at it, but the sort of transforming museums, I've been able to be part of those, which has been very fortunate. So I think it's just where artists have taken me. Why did I do a ceramic show? Because a lot of artists I really liked were starting to work with clay or had been working in clay. And I thought, this needs to be an exhibition. And when I worked on that exhibition, which I did with Ingrid Schaffner at ICA Philadelphia, it was like the first that had really looked at clay as a material for art. I discovered Sheila Hicks' work through a book. I didn't know her work before. I didn't know she was one of the most well-known artists working in fiber. I mean, working in art history is a process of discovery, right? And I think it's, in the last 10 years, it's become much more directed, I will admit. And I think like you, Connie, I mean, you might have some analogies there in your career with mine as well. But you sort of got there a lot sooner, of course, with your incredibly important WAC show at MoCA. And, you set the bar very, very high. And you also, I hate to use this word, but rediscovered a lot of artists who nobody had paid attention to, talked about, written about for a long time, and launched, 10 years of exhibitions thus far, right? And I think we see that also with when we look at work like Leonor, it's the same thing. Somebody's going to see that work at the Hammer and they're going to read that wall label and say, I don't know Kay Sekimachi. I don't know Trude Guermonprez. I'm going to look them up. Same thing with fiber or whatnot. I think exhibitions are propositions. And the best outcome of any exhibition is that somebody says, I need to look into that and I need to make an exhibition. Mm-hmm. So I think I didn't actually answer your question. I'm hearing myself, but I can't claim to have ownership over everything I've done, right? It's the accident of where you work and who you're with and who tells you things and where the artists take you.
Well, that's a very specific way and a political way of framing your own practice, though, I think, which I think as feminists, but thanks for the kind words about WAC. I want to ask you both, but Leonor in particular, I mean, you both just mentioned kind of biography and the stories of these women. And I was thinking that, now I think it's something that we've incorporated into artistic, but also curatorial methodology is the notion of the biography, which for so many years, at least in my training, and I'm sure yours, was absolutely forbidden. You had to ignore it. You definitely weren't supposed to include it in any kind of reading of work. And yet both of you rely on it in different ways really strongly, I think. And that's a very, in this kind of the subjectivities of their lives. And even Leonor in your title, which I want you to address, the homemaker and her domain, because you didn't talk about that. So maybe explain that, but just talk about how you think about that, the role of the stories of these women's lives in the work.
So the title is actually a quote by Charlotte Perriens. So she's written this series of texts, and there's this really great that I've met, Mary McLeod. Maybe you heard about her. She teaches at Columbia.
Yeah.
She's amazing. And she introduced me to other people like this Japanese, what's his name? I really wanted to mention him. I have here my notes because I'm not familiar with Japanese. But he wrote a really, his name is Yasushi Zeno. She's someone that Mary collaborated with. Mm-hmm. And so she put us in contact, and he wrote a really wonderful text about Charlotte Perrien staying in Japan. Mm-hmm. And he really explains the history, the context where she's coming from, in which economical period Japan is. So he really situates, and kind of in the end of the text says that she's very naive. She doesn't understand anything about how Japan culture is associated with South Asia. And so he calls her basically naive, but that she's very important in the context of where she introduces a set of things that are able, and this is what I think we discussed in the last question, the idea that these people set a set of rules that able other people to continue developing work because they had settled these rules. So she settles these rules, which is the idea of designers working with craftsmen, mm-hmm. and really working with traditional ways of using materials, very ancient, so to say. And then this leads to other people in the future, even if it's 10 years after, which happens in her case. She's very criticized, but after 10 years, she comes back, she does another show, and she settles, working methods for other artists to be able to, work the way she did, but developing other things. That's how Noguchi ends up making his akari lamps, because she settles these rules of artists really negotiating with these really specific craftsmen in very remote parts of the country. But this notion of the biography, for me, I'm not a storyteller, but I think, I also don't want my works to be literal, because I think it's important to have some kind of ambiguity, and then it's very formal work. So I'm very interested in crafts. I'm very interested in working, for example, with wood. I really like this idea of the, again, talking about Japan, the idea of the rebuilding of the shrines, which for me, it's such a beautiful kind of relation with working with sculpture, which is the idea of memory and the idea of rebuilding things in order not to lose the skills. So this idea of craftsmanship is never lost. Mm-hmm. And for me, this is it's quite metaphorical process for sculpture, but also thinking about the idea of ancient Greek sculptures, which were made of bronze, which were melted to produce weapons because they needed weapons for war. So we don't have metal. So let's just, reuse these sculptures to use metal from it. But the sculpture is still there for me. And the material is there, the sculpture is there. It has another context shape. But I think this capacity of being transformed, mm-hmm. is what I really, kind of appreciate in sculpture, which I think is very particular to sculpture and not to painting or other forms of photography or film. Mm-hmm. But the idea of biography for me, again, it's important. I don't think it's important as the object in itself. For sure, other times, as you said, the idea of information now to talk about the researches you do were very specific for oneself. And today people use it, and sometimes they overuse it, I think. And for me, it's still important to create this ambiguity in space and see that the materials exist. They have been working in a very specific way. I still believe in the specificity of the making, of the handmaking. And so I try to not be literal in the sense that I don't think I need the text. Sometimes, as Janelle was saying, or even I actually didn't know about the titles of Kay Sekimachi, the homages she pays to Paul Klee and these works I didn't know, and I thought it was interesting that she's also referring her titles to the first letters of the names of the people she's paying homage to. That's actually what I do as well. Sometimes not to be try to be too literalized, name a sculpture. Normally they have names of people. Sorry, my bell is ringing. And of the people I'm referring to. And I think this is try to give characters to the sculptures, but also to, in a certain way, talking about them, but being not so specific. So creating a kind of ambiguity in it.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that, Connie, and agree with you that yes, my training is the same as yours. Biography is forbidden, and there are still artists that I work with who ask that not be included, in the the catalog essay. The work be taken and taken as it is, taken at face value, so to speak, as much as it can. But I don't know, I'm a reader. I love stories, and I love to just find out every single detail I can about an artist. Maybe I don't include it all. And I don't know, it is a kind of constant tension, isn't it? This navigating the story and therefore how the object came to be, or letting the object live on its own. And I think it's especially fraught with craft, the way we talk about craft and the material, because it's so technical. I think you could say the same thing about print. There's so much reliance on well, how is it made? How did they do that? We're talking about somebody like weavers like Kay Sekimachi and Guermonprez. I mean, they were weavers. They're not weavers trying to be artists. They're weavers. That's very first. Their work is addressed to weavers. It is addressed to the material. But Kay, for example, is very much a formalist. Anni Albers was a formalist. Trude was a formalist. The work comes first. The story is second, if there is a story of the work. But, I still walked you through Kay Sekimachi's work and said, then she made this, then she made this. And I know the reasons why. But I love a good story. It's really seductive go on, please.
And you just, when you were introducing her, you actually just barely mentioned that she was interred also in California, which of course is a hugely formative thing in a biography. And I mean, it occurs to me as we're all talking that, in a way, to be removed from one's biography is a point of privilege, right? That it's actually about privilege as we're, as we now understand it.
Exactly.
And so in fact, those things are interwoven and can never be separated actually from the work.
Yeah, that's a gift. I mean, you want to dig into that, but then you also Kay Sekimachi, she never talks about being interned. And I mean, she does. It's not, she does, but like with many of her generation, it was kind of strong front, get it done, make the best of it. Ruth Asawa was also interned, of course, so present in her biography. But I don't know where we're going to end up with stories, because now we are seeing them kind of come back. But that's really important because it allows us to, as you say, to have a greater understanding of privilege, of context, of what someone is allowed to do. But perhaps these kind of biographies are so important when we do talk about artists who are women and artists of color, because the conditions have been so drastically different than the mainstream story. Why do I know the name of every woman that Picasso was married to, but I hardly know anything about Trude Guermonprez? I mean, I think very slowly trying to flip this script, many of these scripts, and it's ever changing. I mean, it seems like the way we do our work changes fundamentally every 10 years or so. And kind of see where we're at, and great change the last couple of years, seismic change. So
I think I should bring us to a close, but I'm also would just love to hear if you have questions for one another, or if there's anything else you want to finish with.
I wish I could have seen the Kay Sekimachi show. Unfortunately, I didn't see, but I actually would have loved to meet her. I mean, some years ago, when I did the SF MoMA exhibition in 2016, 17, something like that, I visited Ruth Asawa's, her son opened the house for us. And for me, it was so sad because I mean, one of the sons managed to buy the house so she could preserve this as her memory as well. He still lives there. One of the sons, I think the youngest one.
Whose
and you
son,
could see
Leonor?
the son of Ruth Asawa.
Oh, okay. So thank you. Yeah.
And you could see the roof. I was looking for sculptures and there was no single sculpture. And so they kept one in the basement for me to see. And they were sending it to, I think, Auschwitz by that time. It was a long time ago. And so they took it out of the box and they showed it to me. So it was actually the first time I saw a real one. But I was looking at the roof. It's all full of these hooks, but it's all empty. And I thought this has been such a beautiful context to, you know, like, of course, this idea of like a single person working from home. No, because I mean, she wouldn't have assistants, or if you think like someone like, I mean, Connie, she did this amazing show of Marisa Mers, you know, this amazing, for me, they are still the most incredible sculptures, or living sculptures in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And I really think this is such a gift, you know, like to be able to see these things on time. Of course, we didn't, and I was expecting to see some of these sculptures hanging in that roof, but everything was empty. So for me, it was moving to meet the family and being there. And, you know, really, they were so adorable because they were just waiting for me to come to just show one piece, you know, like, because the piece was going to be shipped. But still, you know, for me, it was quite sad how come they didn't preserve the house, for example, to have some of her sculptures there, or a museum could invest in that. You know,
I think it's, I love in your work, Leonor, especially at the Hammer, that, well, first of all, the title is really incredible, Homemaker and Domain. We to talk about the way that women artists especially either want to work at home, for ease had to work at home. Kay Sekimachi works at home, always has.
Exactly.
You know, they have like a room off here, a room off there, but the life and the art is integral, right? It's kind of why we're all in this game. It's that we don't need to separate art and life. It's, I mean, it might have its challenges, but it's more generative when it's all together, when it's really all around you. But I was so surprised to walk into the Hammer and see your work and be like, wait, what? Just now Leonor's on in this stuff. This is okay. So I think, you're going to have to come back and visit Kay at her home. And
Definitely.
it was so great to hear about your work. Thank you. I don't want to keep us. So I do have 1,000 questions, but I'll you know, let you get back to your evening in Berlin and our morning in Los Angeles, right?
Thank you
It's just,
so much.
it's wonderful to be here with the two of you. And yeah, I think I'm also really happy to be, as I said, to be in this show. I think it's so rare that one artist is really, you know, engaged with doing a group show. It's so rarely that, you know, it's difficult to do a group show, no? I think.
Oh my God, and it's an incredible group show. Can I just like props to you and Anni Albers, because the Witch Hunt is an incredible exhibition. I mean, I feel like curator stumping for curator, but like, don't miss it. Don't miss it.
Thank you. Well, and during the pandemic, that was interesting as well. But anyway, Leonor, so happy to have your work in it, and really the audience is enjoying it so much. And I know that this talk will help amplify it too, and become part of the archive around the show. So thank you both for doing this and being in conversation, and to be continued.
Thank you.
Yes.